如果我跟你说你能在短短几个月内熟练掌握汉语的听说读写，你会相信吗？先把信不信这事儿放在一边，现在可以先想一下，真的有了这个技能的话，你会做什么的？我来给你举几个例子。首先，你能与这个地球上18亿人沟通，建立个人关系或者商务发展联系。说中文这个事儿并不仅限于中国，也包括泰国、新加坡、马来西亚、印度尼西亚等国家，都有大量长居人口说中文。除此之外，其实不管你在西方哪个国家、哪个城市，你总能遇到很多旅居海外的中国人，不管是和他们交朋友还是做生意，你都有很多机会用到中文。中文在不久的将来会成为全世界最有价值的语言之一，这不是一个人云亦云的事儿，这是毋庸置疑的。现在很多西方的教育系统都把中文定为第二语言，尤其是在欧洲。随着中国经济的不断发展，你其实能够很容易地感知到中文的实用性也随之增长。除此之外呢，会说汉语其实是一件很酷的事情，也会是你简历上一个闪光点，更能让你在人群中显得与众不同。So what about me? How has learning Chinese helped my life personally and affected me? Well, I found love because of it. I found many friendships. I've had lots of financial opportunities over the years, and I get to do the thing I love, which is what I'm doing right now. I get to teach Chinese. My friend Phil and I, just like so many who take on Mandarin as a second language, had to go through a lot of frustration, wasted time and money in order to get to our high level. Today, I want to talk to you about where Phil and I went wrong and the secrets we discovered that led to us creating a series of patent pending techniques that are also going to make you fluent and literate in Chinese faster and easier than ever. I was 19 when I first came to China. I'd saved up all year during my gap year and came to China for the final 2 months before starting university. And before that, a month before, I had practiced every day using a listen and repeat program for Mandarin Chinese, and it paid off. I had an incredible time. I'm sure it would have been incredible anyway, but I traveled around China, and I know that my trip was made so much better because of my very basic understanding of a few survival words and phrases and great pronunciation, which I'd really spent time practicing. And I think, to be honest, I may have got a bit of an inflated ego from my time there because Chinese people are so complimentary, especially if you make an effort to learn their language well. And it gave me a kind of the wrong idea about how easy Chinese would be to learn, because when I returned to China a few years later, about 5.5 years ago now, I thought I could, quote, do Chinese in a year. And I didn't really know what that meant at the time, but I thought I could just become fluent and in Chinese in 1 year. I was very, very wrong. Little did I know at the time, I had no idea what I was talking about, and I'd bitten off a lot more than I could chew. Now, although admittedly I was a bit overconfident, I was very, very motivated and willing to work a lot of hours to gain this skill. So when I arrived in China, pretty much straight away, I decided, okay, I'm going to get myself a tutor and a textbook and get to work, get to the grind. You know, no pain, no gain, right? And the funny thing is about that concept, it implies that if you're enjoying the process, it's not really working for you. And I didn't enjoy the process at school that much, and I certainly didn't enjoy it at university. But now that I was completely free, completely on my own to do whatever I wanted, I still chose. The first thing I did was choose to subject myself to that completely voluntarily, that traditional forced style of learning that never really worked for me. Why is that? My first Chinese textbooks were filled with words I didn't know, which were made up of characters I couldn't read, write, or pronounce. Without an English translation and a lot of guidance from my tutor, I had no chance of understanding what was in front of me. There are even Tang Dynasty poems in my first textbook. I am not kidding you. Basically, I found this way of learning just as painful and boring and ineffective as I did in school. So I decided to drop my textbooks. I've dropped my tutors. Couldn't really afford them anyway, to be honest. And I decided to go for a more
modern approach. So I started to delve into apps and websites, things that would help me build my vocabulary quickly, sort of trying to hack the process doing that. And I found some success, but thanks to my obsessive personality, I managed to use certain websites that I could learn 5,000 words. I learned 5,000 words in about 6 months or so using these digital flashcards and mnemonics. And I found it very satisfying. I was building up this vocabulary, all these words in my head. It was going quite well. Throughout this time, while I was building up this vocabulary, I was also spending a lot of time putting a lot of focus on speaking whenever I could. After all, I was in China and, I'm fairly outgoing, so I thought I could, make use of my surroundings and practice my speaking as much as I could. So over this period of time, I certainly improved to some degree, but it was just, I was putting in several hours a day, like 2 or 3 hours a day on average, and I just wasn't getting the results that I wanted. So at this point, it was now 1 year in. I had invested a year of my time, and I was not anywhere near fluent. I had not done Chinese as I said I would, so confidently, which was a very big hit to the ego, which I probably needed at that time, to be honest. The worst part about it was as well, I had all these words floating around in my head. I didn't really know them, but I sort of did, and I couldn't use them in any meaningful way. So I thought, I know, let's look on the positive side and try and solve this problem. I have the vocabulary now. I didn't, but I thought I had the vocabulary. So I need to figure out how to use these words. What is that? Well, that's what grammar does, right? Grammar is how words are used. So I just need to go and learn grammar. And that became my next, I would say mission, but it's more like my next shot in the dark. When I think back on that, it's quite funny because the whole reason I was in that mess in the first place was I kept relying on my intuition about language instead of actually researching how it's learned. I just kept guessing and guessing. Anyway, this was my next guess. Now, I wasn't technically wrong about my assumption that I needed to learn grammar, but it was the way I went about it, which was completely wrong. So I found a website called All Set Grammar Learning Wiki. Now, I'm not saying this website isn't useful. It's a very useful reference tool.
Every grammar point laid out from beginner to advanced, explained in wonderfully clear language.
But the way I used it, well, a textbook would have been much more effective. So after yet another failure with Chinese, investing a lot of my time and effort and sweat and not really getting anything out of it, I was getting frustrated to the point of, hey, I'm just going to move on to something else. This is not for me, right? And I think a lot of people get that as well. I just didn't know where I was with the language. I didn't know how to get to the next step or even what the next step was. And it was basically because I'd never learned a second language before. And that's when it finally hit me. Why don't I stop looking inwards and start looking outwards, start researching how language is actually learned based on the decades of linguistic research that is out there, and also, of course, even better, the actual polyglots of the world, the people that learn languages for a living, these people that as adults who have learned 5, 10, 20 languages, what do they have to say about language learning? And that's when things finally started taking a turn for the better. So applying all this research and all these techniques that we had learned, I had gone from struggling with Chinese to the point of almost giving up to fluent and literate within about a year. So we knew we were onto something good. And
a year later, we both passed the highest level Chinese exam called the HSK6. In fact, it turned out that despite our rocky starts, we still managed to pass it in around 25% of the average time. It's supposed to take 4 years of full-time study. It took both of us about 2 years of part-time study. I went from struggling with basic phrases and considering giving up on the language completely to fluent and literate in a year. When we had passed that exam together at the same time, we decided to join forces and share our findings through live classes with expats here in Chengdu. We gradually refined the course through hundreds of hours of online classes with people all around the world. Now, 3 years later, we've developed our own entire system for learning Chinese acquisition from beginner to advanced that works for everyone. These methods are now patent pending and they're ready to share with you in video format.
But before I go into any major detail about our actual techniques and how you can apply them to learn Chinese quickly, first I'd like to fill in that big gap in my story there. What exactly is it that I learned that led to such a huge improvement in my Chinese in such a short time? Well, what I'm going to tell you might surprise you, might shock you a little bit, because it does go against what we've been taught in school about how languages are learned. But trust me, it's going to make your life a lot easier. First, I'd like to tell you that none of us are bad at languages.
This is a phrase many of our past clients have used to describe themselves before doing very, very well with our materials.
Sure, we all have differences in IQ, attention spans, openness to new information, but we also have an innate ability to acquire language that we've got from millions of years of evolution. So learning a second language, even one as different as Chinese, can actually be really easy and even fun as long as you work with your brain instead of against it. So many of us throughout our school years are given the completely wrong idea about how languages are learned, ways that work against our nature. So therefore, it's really important to first unlearn this way of thinking before diving into Chinese. Now, I also want to say that I'm not here, Phil and I are not here just to trash schools and universities, not at all. We understand why they work the way they do in spite of all the research going against it. And to explain why that is, we have to first explain the difference between two words: acquisition and learning. Acquisition is the achievement of a native-like usage and understanding of a language. It's our goal. Learning, in the traditional sense, is what we're all more familiar with: teachers, textbooks, grammar explanations, things like that. So you could say that acquisition is more like learning a language in the actual sense, like we did with our native language, whereas what learning ends up being most of the time is a study of a language. But just remember that just because you know how a grammar point works doesn't mean you'll be able to use it. And it's another way of looking at it is, it's kind of the difference between just getting a joke and finding it funny, or having a comedian break down the structure of a joke and explaining to you why it's funny. Now, the latter is not any less valuable, but I know which one I'd prefer. I would prefer to actually just laugh, and I would prefer to actually just use the language rather than understand how it works piece by piece. Acquisition is also mostly subconscious, and learning is conscious. So this is where we really give universities and schools a break, because how do you test something which is subconscious? It's quite difficult, right? You need concrete testing in order to gauge where the students are at. And likewise, the students, they do tend to like textbooks and stuff like that in some ways, because you can just finish a textbook chapter and say, I have finished this chapter complete. I have answered the questions. I've done the exam. I now learned that. I know it, so I can move on. So, okay, if acquisition is the goal, how do we do it? And how do we do it quickly and easily? Well, according to the most cited linguistic research over the last few decades,
we acquire language in one way and only one way: when we understand messages.
If you only take away one thing from this video, please let that be it. Understanding messages, getting input through reading and listening is the best way to learn a language. So does that mean the problem's solved for you? So you just go and start reading Chinese and listening to Chinese? Of course not. We've still got a lot of work to do.
because if you sat in front of a Chinese television every day for 10 years, that would be a very bad way to learn Chinese.
You can only really acquire the language effectively if you understand the message of what you're reading or what you're listening to. And this is often referred to as comprehensible input.
We have an innate function in our brains, let's call it the language module or the language acquisition device. Now, what this part of our brain does is it does not memorize sentences that you see here and then regurgitate them. What it does is, after enough input, enough reading and listening to sentences with similar grammar patterns, it notices the way these words behave. So, for example, you could imagine that this brain is either your brain when you're a baby learning English, or you can imagine these sentences are Chinese, and this is the early stages of your Chinese learning journey. So you start taking in sentences like these. I like golf. Golf is relaxing. I like fishing for salmon. So you start taking in these sorts of structures, and after enough exposure, your brain clicks and you'll be able to combine various structures together and create your own sentences, your own language.
So basically, the more sentences that you read and listen to that you can understand, the better. And also it helps if you enjoy what you're reading too. So this will build your understanding of the language effectively if you just keep doing that. But I know a lot of you are thinking at this point, okay, yes, I get the idea now. Reading, listening, that's the thing I want to focus on the most. But when do I actually get to speak and write? Output, when do I do that? Well, the short answer to that is you can only really speak and write correctly what you already know. So you speak and write what you can when you can.
You see, lots of comprehensible input increases your passive vocabulary. That means what you can understand. And after enough repeated exposure and speaking and writing practice, these words can become active vocabulary, things that we can use easily in speaking and writing. The more you feed that language module in the right way, using input that you understand and that you enjoy, the larger your passive vocabulary will become, and therefore the higher your potential active vocabulary can become.
I would say one of the biggest causes of frustration with Chinese among our clients, and maybe language learning in general, is there's too much of a focus on producing the language. Everyone's so eager to speak and even write that they don't spend enough time, nearly enough time, reading and listening to the words in context to understand how they behave and get used to the language. And what this does is causes very bad output. And hey, I'm the biggest offender of this. Remember, I learned thousands of words in a very shallow way using just basically definitions. And any word that wasn't a basic object or noun, I used very badly and inaccurately and got a lot of negative responses and lots of confused looks and even laughs from my Chinese friends. And as well as just being a hit to the ego and not very good for your confidence, what this does is it allows you to start building up bad habits with speaking and producing. And bad habits are really difficult to break. Let's have a look at how it should be done based on all of this research and our years of experience learning and teaching Chinese. What you're looking at here is our Mandarin blueprint. This is our step-by-step general approach that you should take to learning Chinese. So, of course, the first 4 steps of this are all based around getting input through reading and listening. And as you can see, as your understanding of pronunciation, characters, vocabulary, grammar improves, your output naturally at the top there gradually starts to increase as your understanding increases. So now that I've covered that, you have an overall blueprint for learning Chinese, and you are now aware that input should be your main focus, not just at the beginner stage, but it should also be the focus throughout your entire journey with Chinese. And just knowing that already puts you light years ahead of the vast majority of learners. Trust me. I mean, I wish I had known that when I first started out. But that doesn't mean that the battle's over. In fact, we've still got to face the next major problem that faces language learners, and especially learners of languages like Chinese that are a bit more exotic, which is in order to start reading and listening and understanding sentences and feeding your language module, you need to have at least a basic foundation of the most common Chinese words in order to start to understand simple sentences, right?
Now, using traditional methods, a few hundred common characters and words is usually the minimum to achieve this.
Once you get to that stage, you can start consuming content and improving your listening and reading capabilities, and that will allow you to look at more difficult and engaging content and so on and so forth.
So basically, your goal is to get on this positive cycle of reading, listening, then understanding what you read and listen to, which improves your vocabulary and grammar. And then you can be more equipped to listen to more advanced and more engaging material, and that improves you further, and so on and so on and so on.
For Latin-based languages like Spanish or French, once you've got to grips with the basics of the pronunciation and spelling, you can actually start learning words fairly quickly and easily. However, with Chinese, there is the rather unique problem of characters. Now, I put off learning Chinese characters for a long time, and it was the major cause of my slow progress and frustration because I couldn't read mainly. But once I started to learn Chinese characters, everything just started to click into place. If you want to take Chinese to any sort of level, any sort of decent high level, there's just no way around it. You're gonna have to learn Chinese characters, quite a lot of them, and before we came along, there wasn't really a method out there that could allow you to learn everything you need to know about a character easily and quickly, by which I mean not just how to read it, but also how to pronounce it and even how to write it. Now, this character learning method is just one single element of our larger course, the Mandarin Blueprint Method. And what this is an integrated system that teaches you characters, vocabulary, and grammar of Chinese all in one step by step. And it covers about 80% of the language, the most common 1,000 words, and it's doable with our memory techniques in a few months.
In the previous section, Luke talked about the primary problem facing Chinese learners today, or really language learners in general. And that problem really comes down to a question of strategy. Because if you don't have a good strategy for approaching Mandarin that is tangibly different from how you would approach other academic subjects, and for that matter, other languages, well, you're going to fall back on what you know. And what everybody knows is education in school, which consists of things like looking at textbooks and answering textbook questions, listening to a lecture, and when it comes to language, learning things like grammar points. But I'm telling you right now, if you take this approach, there are several downsides, and two of them are opportunity costs relating to time and money, but of course the primary cost is the frustration that you go through when learning in a traditional way. And how do I know? Well, I did it myself. I went through the entire process of getting a degree in Chinese, and it actually held me back way more than I care to admit. Now, answering textbook questions, listening to a lecture, looking up grammar points as if they were equations in a mathematics book, this is not how our brain acquires language. And it's one of those things where when you're in the class, you tend to be confused why the teachers are spending so much time on it, because you can feel that it's not actually effective and you're going through your day-to-day life not actually succeeding in communicating with the Chinese people around you. I took the academic road, and the whole experience didn't really prepare me for speaking in the real world. It did prepare me to be a Mandarin learning coach because I learned a lot about what not to do when studying Chinese. But perhaps the most valuable lesson of all was this: language acquisition is not an academic subject. Now, we completely get why universities treat it like an academic subject, because if I were a university professor, I would think to myself, all right, sure, they acquire language subconsciously, but I don't know how to test that. So what I'll do instead is I'll give them a test of 20 words that I told them to learn, and I'll make sure that they can regurgitate the definition out into the exam page. And then what I'll do is I'll teach them 5 grammar points and make sure that those grammar points come up on the test as well. And this way I can actually give them a grade. So at least they'll walk out of class feeling like they learned something in the class, despite the fact that it's like a leaky sieve. It just goes out as soon as you leave. Hopefully you're starting to see the fundamental problem with treating language as an academic subject. If you are doing it right, you need a coach, not a teacher. A lot of it is in your own hands when it comes to language because it's so personal, it's so instinctual, and it's very unconscious. But it's easy to be lured in by the concreteness of a Chinese class. I'm telling you from hard-won experience, though, it's a wild goose chase for the vast majority of people. Now, if I were to surmise the reason that I was able to overcome the academic approach to learning Chinese, it really comes down to the fact that I didn't listen to the teachers very much. I'm a bit of an autodidact, so I like to figure things out on my own, so I got to researching how language is actually acquired. Now, fortunately, I had friends like Luke who were also unconvinced that tutors in university were the answer, and what I discovered was decades of the most heavily cited linguistic research that comes to the conclusion that we learn our second language, surprise, in very much the same way we did our first. Through listening and reading to content we can understand. Now, linguists refer to this as comprehensible input, and based on my experience as someone who managed to slog my way through academics and come through it still fluent and literate in Chinese, I can tell you this is absolutely true, but it's not lost on me how annoying a conclusion that is to hear when you're just starting out. From your perspective, you're probably thinking, what, am I supposed to just listen and read to comprehensible Chinese? I can't read Chinese. These characters are nothing like a Roman alphabet, and that's exactly the problem. As a beginning learner, finding comprehensible input isn't just a challenge, it is the challenge that has been plaguing linguists for a long time. How are you supposed to read and listen when you don't know any words, much less words that are comprised of elements that have nothing to do with an alphabet? Now, thankfully, Chinese grammar is not all that challenging, but you aren't even going to get close to the grammar acquisition without first mastering that which alphabet-based languages like German and Spanish don't have: characters. Up until now, no proven method can teach you everything about a Chinese character quickly and easily that also applies to pretty much everyone. We mentioned in the last video that we have a proven patent-pending method for learning how to read, write, and pronounce any Chinese character within a matter of seconds. And my favorite thing about it is that unlike academic Mandarin, it does not rely nearly as much on your intelligence to master. All it counts on is the innate power of your imagination. Now I know, there are some of you out there, you're watching this and you're immediately thinking, I'm not imaginative. Yes, you are. I'm going to tell you right now that you are. Don't believe me? Think of the last time you read a work of fiction. There are believable characters and entire worlds whose appearance and structure you created based entirely on a written description that you still remember today, even from years ago. Now, if you're not much of a reader, okay, think of a scene from a movie that you can remember. How about a strong, happy childhood memory? All of those, whether it's the novel, the movie, the memory from your childhood, they're vivid, they're effortless to bring to mind, and they're the exact type of thing that we use when learning a Chinese character. So let's actually give it a shot. I'd like you to imagine that you're standing outside of the first place you lived after you moved out of your parents' house. Now, if you still live with your parents, you can imagine yourself outside of a friend's house, but you're just standing there outside the entrance. Standing there next to you is Shrek, the character from the movie, and he's standing next to the devil. And they appear to be unhappy with each other when the devil pulls out a megaphone and he starts to speak, causing the entire landscape to turn into a hell of his making. So he speaks hell into existence. Now, I'd like you to imagine that you're standing in the break room of one of your former workplaces, or maybe your current workplace, whichever one comes to mind. Now, as you're standing there, there is a floating model of the moon right there. And Marilyn Monroe walks over and she smashes the moon with her fist, causing it to crack open and a little sun comes out. And when that sun comes out of the moon, it's so bright that everybody squints and she puts her sunglasses on. So it might surprise you to find out that we actually just learned everything we need to know about two Chinese characters, and two important Chinese characters at that. So the first one, we had Shrek. Shrek represents S-H-U because the pinyin of this character is shuo, but what about the O in the first tone? Well, that's represented by the location. You're outside the entrance of the first place you lived after you moved out of your parents' house. Outside the entrance represents first tone, and the location itself represents O. So there you go, pronunciation, done and dusted. Then we've got two character components here. The left side means speech. Well, guess what? That's the megaphone. That's why the devil is using the megaphone. The right side component is the devil, because look at it. It looks like a guy with horns. So why not imagine a devil? And then what does he do? He speaks hell into existence, because this character means to speak. And that is an association that I personally have, because it's the opposite of the Christian creation myth of God speaking the world into existence. So that's your first character. Then the second character, Ming, has two components. We've got the sun and the moon. So the components are going to be easy. How about the pronunciation? Well, that's Marilyn Monroe representing M-I. Your office break room represents N-G and second tone. And we got the sun, the moon, and the scene. And then what does this character mean? Well, it means bright or clear. So when the sun comes out, it's too bright. They cover their eyes. They put on sunglasses because it's so bright. We're going to come back to those two scenes in a bit, but not only did you just learn two important Chinese characters, you actually just created two memory palaces. and you can go back and visit. And when it comes to rote learning versus this method for learning characters, which is going to be easier to recall? Well, you can come to your own conclusion as we keep going through this. These techniques have actually been around for thousands of years, going back to the ancient Greeks, but they're still used today by memory athletes who memorize incredible amounts of random information like decimal points of pi or just random digits or the number of playing cards in a deck. They can remember all of these things by using the exact same techniques. Now, in the previous video, we talked about your language module, and the language module has been evolving for about 200,000 years if you don't count body language. I think you should, but let's just say you don't count body language. Spoken language has been evolving for 200,000 years, and that certainly makes it a lot older than the first academic subject, but it makes it a lot newer than the techniques we were using to memorize those two characters before. We used core object recognition, facial recognition, 3D spatial imaging. These are techniques that, because they use our vision and our visual cortex, they go back as far as 700 million years. Visual cortex evolution is legit. So you could argue that this is a software in your brain that is the most evolved software on Earth. So this is what I was saying before about this ability not being limited to smart people, because everybody can do this. There are a few people who have a very rare genetic condition that stops them from being able to visualize in their mind's eye, but the vast majority of us, this is no problem. Now, we first came across this concept by watching a TED Talk by Joshua Foer, a journalist who became a memory champion in 1 year by learning various memory techniques for remembering decks of cards quickly. What we learned from his talk and book, Moonwalking with Einstein, is that
as bad as we are at remembering names and phone numbers and word-for-word instructions from our colleagues, we have really exceptional visual and spatial memories. And I found that this was shockingly fun. I never would have expected that. It was fun because this is actually not about training your memory. What you're doing is you're trying to get better and better and better at creating, at dreaming up these utterly ludicrous, raunchy, hilarious, and hopefully unforgettable images in your mind's eye. At the most basic level, we remember when we pay attention. We remember when we are deeply engaged. We remember when we are able to take a piece of information, an experience, and figure out why it is meaningful to us, why it is significant, why it's colorful.
Now, that talk certainly opened my mind to the potential we all have in our brains to learn things faster and to remember things longer, but it's still not applicable to Chinese specifically. It's, potentially applicable, but we hadn't made the method yet when I first saw that. So when we started to have clients come to us and say, I can't believe how fast I'm learning characters following this method, it was such a relief to us because we thought, okay, is there something we're missing? Is there going to be some reason why this doesn't work for Chinese characters? But no, it totally does. And I'd actually like to point out one in particular, Jo Kellen, and she took our course coming in saying, I'm one of those people who's bad at languages. And as Luke mentioned in the previous video, no one is actually bad at languages, but she had that belief about herself. She learned 600 characters in under a month. That's crazy. It was really incredible that she was able to do that, and compare that to traditional learning, where teachers tend to completely skip learning characters because they only know one way to teach it: rote learning. Ugh. It's just writing the character over and over. But the problem with that is that you don't have a memory palace you can look back to, and it's super dull. Who wants to do that? And besides, we're adults. We don't have the time. Chinese kids have years in school that they can do the rote learning thing. We can't do that. We have lives, responsibilities. We can't spend that many hours a day doing such monotonous work that you don't even remember anyway. So that's why you use the Hanzi movie method. Now look, we're not saying that you don't have to learn characters. What we're saying is that the previous methods for learning characters were more boring, slower, and have a worse mechanism for recalling. So if you do forget a character, you basically have to start from scratch. But with the memory palace, what's great about it is that if you forget a character, you can go back into your memory palace room and it'll come back to you really quickly. In the same way that if you walk by a coffee shop that you haven't been to in years and you look in the window, suddenly you're flooded with memories of times that you spent there. And so once you have this good method for learning characters, you're not only remembering them in the short term, you have a method by which to remember them quickly, 6 months from now, a year from now, when you've forgotten them for whatever reason. Now, of course, you're not finished at characters. You need to keep moving on to the next stage, which is how to learn words and grammar. But the key here is understanding that the vocabulary layer and the grammar layer are far easier than most languages. It's just they have this premise called you need to know the characters first. If you don't know the characters, they're incredibly hard because you don't understand the component parts. But if you do understand the characters, vocabulary words are completely logical and the grammar structures are even simpler than that. So if you understand characters, you really have a shot at succeeding at learning in Chinese. Now, first of all, many characters are words in and of themselves, so you can start building foundational vocabulary just by using the Hanzi movie method. However, most Chinese words are a combination of 2 or more characters, yet they are so logical. They're like the English words playground or tabletop. It's just adding 2 puzzle pieces together for the vast majority. Now, with all this talk of memory athletes and these different techniques that they use, it's natural to ask, well, how does memory actually work? And while memory researchers certainly don't know everything there is to know, there have been discoveries over the past several years that have really opened our eyes to what is actually going on. And one thing that's really important to remember is that memory doesn't only exist in one part of your brain. And this does make sense because all of your senses can be related to memory. You remember how something feels, you remember how something smells. Smell is the strongest one tied to memory. And what that means is that all of your sensual experiences, which function in different parts of your brain, can contribute to memory. So it's not stored in like just one spot. So naturally, the more connections you have to any given concept or fact, like what is a pen, the easier it is to get into your long-term memory, especially if they connect on a number of different sensual levels. And this is true of memories that you have that you didn't intentionally try to keep. So you had some birthday when you were 10 that you remembered your whole life. Well, there's something about that set of experiences that made it easy for you to remember, even though you weren't intentionally trying to learn about it. Now, when you are intentionally trying to learn about it, what's easier to learn? Something with no foundational knowledge whatsoever, or something that is a piggyback on what you already do know? So like a chemist will read the newest chemistry research paper and easily be able to learn the material in it, while, a layman like myself would have no clue. This fundamental principle of memory, that the more connections we have to a new fact, the quicker we put it into our long-term memory, is the exact reason that the memory athletes always build their memory palaces based on places they've actually been, past workplaces, the apartments they've lived in, their childhood home. We do those exact same things in the Hanzi movie method. And you can do very similar things with vocabulary. It doesn't have to be quite as systemized as characters because, once you learn a vocabulary word, you're only one step away from seeing it in a sentence. And then you have the characters helping you remember it, and you have the sentence helping you remember it. But that doesn't mean there aren't loads of things you could do to help you put into your long-term memory super quick. Let's take those 2 characters we learned before, shuo and ming, and put them together to create a word, shuo ming. We talked about how shuo means speak, and ming means either bright or clear. Well, if I'm speaking, shuo, until something becomes clear, ming, what am I doing? I'm explaining something. So let's use 说明 to explain, to come up with an idea of the different mnemonic techniques we could use to put this into our long-term memory really quickly. The first one is obvious, the characters themselves. Most Chinese words, the characters give a really good idea of what it means if you know them. Now, of course, again, argument for learning characters. If you don't know the characters, that's not so easy. But if you do know them, sometimes that's all you need. And when that happens, great, you'll remember it. It's awesome. Now, if looking at the 2 characters alone doesn't make the meaning of the word clear to you, you could then look at the pronunciation and how does it sound. So that's the next one, sound. 说明, 说明. Well, that sort of sounds like swimming. Maybe if you had a sort of heavy Scottish accent, swimming, Sean Connery style. Well, what does that make you think of when you think of swimming? Do you think of an instructor? Maybe the instructor happens to be Scottish, unlikely, but hey, maybe you think of a swimming instructor. Well, a swimming instructor explaining to you your technique is, of course, a connection you can make very easily, and that relates to the third one, which is your memories. If you have an actual memory related to any of these particular words that you're learning, bring it to mind. Again, Google your brain quickly and find it in there, because your real memories or memories of a scene from a movie or a book are the exact thing you need to learn. You need to connect the new fact to something you already know, and sort of by definition, if you still remember something, there's a neural cluster in your brain that's firing. So take the opportunity to sort of weld in that new information as the electricity is shooting between neurons. Next, images. Images is huge. It's hugely helpful, and there's a bunch of research that shows this. We connect to images much more quickly than we do to words. And I mean, this all makes sense because everything that I was telling you before about the evolution of our visual cortex, it relates absolutely the same way to a picture or an image that you see around the time of learning the word. And if you put that into, say, a flashcard, then you'll remember it even more quickly. Now, whether it's the characters themselves, the sound, and the connections that makes you think of, the lived experiences you've had that you can bring to mind, or just an image you find on a Google image search, all of these either are a direct connection to the definition of the word, or they're a link that helps you get there. So, maybe you hear swimming, and that makes you think of Sean Connery as a swimming instructor, and that's just sort of a made-up thing, but it's funny to you, so you got there by going, swimming sounds like swimming, but it sort of sounds like with a Scottish accent, so I think of Sean Connery. It's a link. It's several links down the road, but it works. The ancient Greeks were the ones who came up with this, so it's no surprise that it's actually still effective today. Now, all of these techniques are incredibly effective at helping you remember something for the longest possible period of time after you initially learn it. However, you still are going to have to review sometimes. It is true that sometimes your mnemonic device is so wicked that you just remember it forever on one go, but that's certainly not going to happen for every single thing you need to learn about Chinese, and so you need to have a reviewing mechanism. Even the memory athletes will say that, if they're just trying to remember random decks of cards, they might remember till the end of the day, but when they actually have something they want to remember for real, like a speech or, the name of a person they just met, they'll need to review occasionally just to make sure that the information doesn't get lost to, the long-term memory hole. Now, apart from having a good system for reviewing what you learn through these techniques, you need to make sure you're applying these techniques to an order of characters, words, and grammar that actually keeps you within the realm of what you could possibly understand. Linguists and many learning theorists in general all agree that when it comes to acquiring new knowledge, especially language, you need to be in a realm where you're mostly competent, but pushing yourself a little bit. And that makes sense because you can only learn things that are connected to what you've already established. So the reason I bring that up is because you can't really know what the right order is when you're a beginner. It's very hard to grasp exactly what you should do next, and that's exactly what we set out to solve. How are we going to keep you in that realm where you're competent, but just pushing yourself a little bit? Makes it most like a game of any possible way of going about it.
If you stop watching this video now and you just applied what we've already taught you to your learning and you went on your own, tried to figure it out by yourself using the Mandarin blueprint, the step-by-step guide to Chinese acquisition, and the character learning technique, you tried some sort of memory palace technique, and you also did the word linking technique to learn compound words quickly. If you just did that, you'd already be light years ahead of the average learner. But today I'm going to introduce to you a couple more, the last couple of pieces of the puzzle, starting with retention, how to actually keep this information in your head, because learning is just step one, and any memory athlete will tell you that reviewing and recalling, having a good system for recall, an efficient system, is just as important as the actual techniques themselves. So in the early days of Chinese, you have to learn pronunciation, you have to learn Chinese characters, you have to learn words. And although we have great techniques for each of these things in order to acquire them and learn them quickly, no matter how good the technique is, you're still going to eventually forget the new information. It'll just take a bit longer, that's all. We think that this is one of the main reasons why people are so frustrated with Chinese, especially people that sign up to university, school, or private classes. They don't have a way of retaining the information that is in anywhere close to efficient or enjoyable. So what ends up happening is you go through this very unfortunate cycle of cramming examinations and then forgetting, cramming examinations, forgetting. It's just this cycle for 3 or 4 years, and you end up coming out of university or whatever it is, wherever it is you are, not speaking the language you've been studying for the last several years, and that hurts. And we've actually witnessed horror stories like this personally many times, having both studied Chinese in university. So here is the most efficient way of keeping new information in your head. And memory athletes like 8-time world memory champion Dominic O'Brien swear by this. And we swear by it as well, and so do our clients. It is spaced repetition. Spaced repetition is based on the spacing effect, which is research that's well over 100 years old now that shows it's much better to review information over longer and longer intervals rather than cramming everything and learning everything together in one go. You'll most often see this in the form of digital flashcards powered by spaced repetition software, or SRS as we call it. This contains an algorithm which records how well you know each flashcard by recording how well you answer. Once enough time passes that you only have a 90% chance of remembering something, the algorithm will show you that card. Every time you recall that piece of information, your memory becomes stronger, making the interval to the next repetition longer. So, this means that as long as you review flashcards every day, you will always have a retention rate of around 90 to 95%. It will always be bubbling at that level. And that goes to show why Phil and I, when we were in university, we never had to cram for exams ever, and we always got at least 90%. So you can do the same there too. So it's not just about using SRS, you also have to use it in the right way. And we'll get into that in a little bit when we talk about flashcards. But first I want to talk to you about the next key piece of the puzzle in today's video. So far, we've been speaking mainly about learning little pieces, learning characters, learning individual words. And what we could describe this as is bottom-up learning, which is what it sounds like. You're starting from the little pieces and you're working your way up to the bigger pieces like sentences, dialogues, stories, those sorts of things. Now, top-down learning, as you may already have guessed, is starting from the bigger pieces and working your way down. So, for example, how I started learning Chinese. Remember from the first video, I told you that I jumped into a listen and repeat program. So they would say a Chinese phrase and I would just parrot it to myself and just did that over and over again. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, and there's nothing inherently wrong with bottom-up learning either, but we need to look at these two concepts in a bit more detail because it's very important to get the balance right. Now, with Chinese, there needs to be a little bit more bottom-up learning at first. It's unavoidable because, as we've already mentioned, you have to learn characters, and that, of course, would be bottom-up. But the reason why I struggled so much with Chinese was because I just flitted from top down completely to bottom up completely, just back and forth throughout the entire journey. So let me give you a bit of an explanation of what I mean here. So I started off just by listening and repeating blindly to various phrases in the language. So that's, of course, very, very top down. And then I tried to decipher walls of Chinese text without any knowledge of characters or much vocabulary. That was my first textbook, by the way. Then my first Chinese tutor made me write out Chinese characters, rather complicated Chinese characters, over and over again, rote learning, without thinking about the individual components within the characters. And believe it or not, that's also top down, because I'm not thinking about the smaller details. I'm just writing out characters. Then I went on to learn thousands of words individually without seeing them in context. So again, this is completely bottom-up learning. And throughout this time, I was trying to focus more and more on just purely speaking and sort of guessing how the words were used. Again, repeating back what I'd heard from native speakers. This is purely top-down again. And then I started writing out grammar points as a means of trying to figure out how to use the words by just looking at grammar points. Now, I don't think that counts as bottom-up or top-down. It's just overall generally quite useless. Then I finally realized I needed to learn characters, and I learned 3,000 characters using the mnemonic visualization memory palace technique that we talked about in 6 months. So that was my main focus, of course, very bottom up. And then I finally started to figure it out, and I started to read content and listen to content that I pretty much understood as a means of learning new words. So that's kind of a nice mix of bottom up and top down. And that finally is actually a positive thing that I did, a good idea to mix those two together. So what was so bad about this way of going about learning Chinese for me? Well, it certainly wasn't the individual steps. I mean, learning characters, solidifying your pronunciation through listening and repeating to native audio. These are all great, these steps that I've laid out. But it was the fact that, first of all, I focused on mainly one thing at a time. Instead of learning things and practicing things in unison with each other, it was meant just focusing on speaking for a while, then learn characters for a while, then learn words. So it's very disjointed. But maybe more serious was the fact that I went about this in the completely wrong order. The best way to learn things is to build on what you already know. And that's what eventually led us to create our Mandarin blueprint, that step-by-step process. So if you take a look at this step-by-step blueprint that we've given you, you can see that the steps aren't independent of each other at all. They overlap very closely. So if bottom-up learning, learning the individual pieces, is the equivalent to, say, making bricks, and top-down is the equivalent to building a house, well, we don't actually just want a brickyard, and we don't want a rubbish house with bad foundations that's going to collapse on us. And likewise, we don't just want to spend all of our time learning individual characters and individual words. I did this thousands and thousands of times over. And we don't just want to parrot sentences and phrases or start trying to read walls of text, because it's almost like decoding a German psychology textbook for me. It's doable, but it's very, very energy sapping and very, very time inefficient. And nothing will stick because you have no foundational knowledge for it to grab onto. So as I said, we need to go for a more holistic approach, or you could say a mixed approach. We need to think about first making some bricks really well, and then go and build some of the house. Make some more bricks, build some more of the house. And this way, we not only have a much more satisfying time because we understand everything we're doing and everything's sticking and we're remembering it very, very easily, but we're also building an incredibly strong foundation on which to learn Chinese in the long run a lot faster and a lot easier. So let's take a little step back from this house and bricks analogy for a second. And let's look at how it applies in reality, how this actually really applies to Chinese. So the mixed approach would be, for example, you learn characters, but you don't just learn characters like I did at first by just writing them out over and over again. You learn them properly by learning the components that make them up. You learn the pronunciation, and naturally you'll learn how to write them as well. And you don't just learn the characters independently. You also learn the characters, and then you learn some common words that they are used in, so some compound words. And of course, you don't just learn the words individually, because that's not really learning a word. You learn characters and words in the context of sentences to see them in their, I guess you could say, their natural habitat. So this would be a great example of a mixed approach to Chinese, and this is what we strive for at Mandarin Blueprint as well. Once you're at the point where you can actually read a Chinese sentence without help from Pinyin, the ABCs of Chinese, you're just reading the message and taking it in. That means you're acquiring language. You're feeding your language module the food it loves, comprehensible input. And obviously it's even better if you enjoy the content, but just understanding it is enough for now, especially as a beginner. And this is the entire purpose of Mandarin Blueprint. This is to get you from nothing, from a complete beginner, to reading Chinese as fast as possible. This is also how we learn grammar the easy way, the natural way. So in the first video, you might remember that I talked to you about how grammar is acquired. It's not acquired through looking at explanations or equations, but it's acquired through listening and reading to the words in the context of sentences. Your brain naturally notices patterns, and after enough repeated exposure, you can eventually start using the structures yourself. You can start focusing on finding sentences to learn more and more new words and build your vocabulary that way, alongside continuously building up your knowledge of characters. This is also known as sentence mining, and there's lots of ways you can find sentences, lots of good resources for this. You can use online dictionaries, phrase books, hey, even textbooks have a lot of good example sentences. I personally love podcasts and podcast transcripts. So that's a great way of doing that. And eventually you can just forego the whole idea of individual words and just learn through sentences, because you have that foundational knowledge now. And then you can move on to more difficult but also more engaging material, such as graded readers. These are articles or stories that are graded to a specific vocabulary level, which are fantastic resources. Interesting podcasts. You can also read comics or play computer games. You can really start following your interests more. And by this point, you would have reached what we like to call the acquisition cycle. It's that positive cycle of getting input, which you like or which you understand, which improves your level. And so that allows you to search for more difficult and more engaging input that is more attuned to your personal tastes. And that, of course, makes you better. And it's just that cycle goes on and on and on. Now, once you're here, once you're at this point, you are on the home stretch. So you can start consuming more input that you like. You can start producing more, start focusing on speaking and writing. And you can just watch as your skills develop. So this is how it should go. This is the ideal situation. But in practice, it's a little bit more tough than meets the eye. For one thing, if you're a beginner, which most of you are, you're going to find it very difficult to find sentences that you can understand the message of because your vocabulary is too low, right? So that beginning stage is going to be quite tough for you. So this is really the catch-22 of the beginner learner, especially when it comes to learning Chinese, because as a beginner, you want to learn and build your vocabulary as quickly as possible by seeing new words in context of sentences. But most sentences you don't understand because your vocabulary is too low. So how can we solve that? So let's take a look at a few example sentences for a word that we learnt in the last video, explain, 说明. This first sentence is from bing.com/dict, one of my favorite online dictionaries for Chinese sentences. And although the sentences are all very accurate, as a beginner, there's not really much you can glean from a lot of these sentences. And even if you can, you don't know if these sentences are of the spoken style or the written style. Most languages, all languages I believe, have a certain way of speaking and then another different way of writing. So let me explain to you what I mean. So this first sentence, the English translation is incredibly simple. And you might look at that and think, wow, that seems like an ideal sentence for me. So I'm going to learn this sentence. I'm going to review it in my flashcards. But the first thing I notice about this sentence is it includes some very high-level vocabulary, and it's also very formal. It's only written. People would never say this unless in a formal speech. There's a couple of words here, namely 清晰 and 思想. They are both quite high-level words, especially the first one there. And this sentence overall is very, very formal. So as you can see, as a beginner, you're going to find it very hard to get the message of these sentences, and therefore they're not going to serve the purpose that they're supposed to. You're not going to be able to feed your language module. And even though we can give you an overall plan, we can give you great methods using mnemonic techniques for learning characters and words, you're still going to find it hard to find natural, useful sentences that you can now apply to the real world. With the current methods that are available out there, the only real way to overcome this problem is to go through what we call the grind. You just have to keep grinding those characters and grinding those words. So that word comes from the gaming industry. So if your level's not quite high enough to pass to the next area or to defeat the next boss, you just have to do little tasks repetitively to build up your level. So this is kind of the same thing. So many people that want to go for Chinese on their own and tackle the language head on, like Phil and I did, they run into this issue and they end up just having to grind. They end up having to do what I did, learn thousands of characters independently, learn thousands of words independently, and try and piece it all together and consolidate it later on. And it's just really tough. And I don't blame people for dropping out at this point and gradually moving towards the traditional approach again, because at least traditional learning like textbooks and classrooms, yes, it can be boring and not that efficient, but at least it's concrete. At least you feel like you're making progress. But most people are not willing to do that, and I do not blame them. They're not willing to subject themselves to the traditional methods, and they're also not willing to go it alone and try and figure it out for themselves and do that grind that we talked about. This is the core mission of Mandarin Blueprint, to solve this problem once and for all, to make sure that you as a beginner or even an intermediate learner can get to advanced literacy in Chinese as
quickly as possible, to be able to read Chinese and understand Chinese, so you can start feeding that language module without having to go through a boring grind of repetitively studying thousands of characters and thousands of words without any context. This system, which we call the Mandarin Blueprint Method, contains all of the techniques that we've been talking about in the last 3 videos, including our mnemonic visualization technique for learning characters, for learning words, and of course for acquiring grammar through reading sentences that you can understand. It's all wrapped into one integrated linear system. So as a beginner, for example, you can just press play and you can work your way through the videos, follow our instructions, and you will become literate and you will be able to understand Chinese faster than ever thought possible. So Phil and I are very excited about that, because it's been several years of hard work in the making and we're finally ready to release it to the public. Right now you should be seeing a button coming up. If you click that, it will take you straight through to the Mandarin Blueprint Method page, where we tell you all about the product in detail, including pricing as well. You also have the option of joining our other 40-minute webinar, where we break down visually exactly what's on the course for you. So thank you very much for listening today, and we'll see you soon.